November 1177. The Palestinian desert breathes scorching dust under a merciless autumn sun. The air is thick, a mixture of the sweat of thousands of men, the stench of horse manure, and that subtle, metallic tang of fear that always precedes a great slaughter. On the hill at Montgisard stands the greatest commander of the Islamic world, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known in the West as Saladin. His army, estimated at up to 26,000 warriors, is not merely a force. It is a living river of steel, banners, and fanatical faith, ready to wash away the last fragile creation of the Crusaders, the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Saladin is calm. He is at the zenith of his power, having united Egypt and Syria. Before him now stands a handful of Franks, desperate, trapped against the coast, and led by a boy. He already savors the triumph, the easy victory that will open the gates of the holy city to him. But what he sees next makes even him, a veteran of dozens of battles, freeze in disbelief. From the Crusader ranks, barely numbering 400 knights and a few thousand infantry, a litter is carried forth. Upon it sits a figure shrouded in white robes. The face is hidden behind a motionless silver mask, through whose slits gaze eyes burning with an unnatural, feverish fire. This is the 16-year-old King Baldwin IV. His body is being consumed by leprosy. He cannot hold a sword, nor can he sit upon a horse. But when the greatest relic of the Christian world, a fragment of the true cross, is raised before him, he leans on it, slides from his litter, and falls to his knees in the dust. His lips whisper a prayer, and the echo of this silent plea sweeps through the ranks of his warriors. In that instant, the unthinkable happens. The knights, seeing their dying king praying for them, are seized by a holy madness. They do not charge. They crash down upon Saladin's army like the wrath of God. It was not a battle, but a massacre. How? How did this dying boy, this living corpse, manage to perform one of the greatest military miracles in history? In this question lies the entire essence of his tragic and magnificent life. In this paradox is forged the legend of the Leper King. To understand how this incredible victory was possible, one must grasp the volcanic soil on which the Kingdom of Jerusalem stood. It was not a monolithic state, but rather a patchwork of counties and baronies, carved by the swords of the First Crusade from the body of the Middle East at the end of the 11th century. It was an island, Outre-mer, the land beyond the sea, as the Franks called it, surrounded on all sides by the ocean of the Islamic world. Life here was a constant war, where truces were merely brief respites to sharpen swords and count the dead. The culture of this place was a unique but fragile alloy. European knights in heavy armor learned to fight in the desert, adopted elements of Eastern luxury, and built magnificent castles like Crac des Chevaliers or Montfort, whose power still captures the imagination. But beneath this veneer of relative stability, the embers of animosity always smoldered. On one side were the old families, the Polani, born in the Holy Land, who were more pragmatic and inclined toward diplomacy with their Muslim neighbors. On the other, new waves of Crusaders constantly arrived from Europe, full of religious fanaticism and a thirst for glory, ignorant of the region's complex political games and ready to break any truce for plunder or a heroic deed. And into this simmering cauldron, this powder keg, the shadow of Salah ad-Din falls in the mid-12th century. He was not just another local emir. He was a genius of strategy and politics, who managed what no one before him had, to unite the two main powers of the Islamic world, Egypt and Syria, under his banner. He created a unified front that squeezed the Crusader kingdom in a deadly grip from the north and south. For the Franks, this meant the end of an era of fragmented enemies with whom they could make separate alliances. Now they faced a single, powerful empire led by a genius whose proclaimed goal was the expulsion of the infidels from Jerusalem. The kingdom braced for the storm, and it was at this very moment that a child, marked by a terrible seal, was destined to ascend its throne. Baldwin IV was descended from the Angevin dynasty, a branch of French nobility whose ambitions and marital alliances had entangled all of Europe, providing kings to England and Jerusalem. His father, Amalric I, was an active and intelligent ruler, constantly maneuvering between the Byzantine emperor, the Egyptian Fatimids, and the Syrian Zengids, trying to strengthen his kingdom's precarious position. Baldwin's blood was the blood of warriors and politicians, men accustomed to ruling and fighting. From his birth in 1161, he was prepared for a great destiny. He was the long-awaited heir, upon whom all the court's hopes rested. His education was entrusted to one of the wisest and most learned men of his era, the Archbishop and historian William of Tyre. It is from William's chronicles that we know of the tragic discovery that forever changed the young prince's life and the history of the entire region. William of Tyre describes how one day, while watching the 9-year-old Baldwin playing with other noble boys, he noticed something strange. The children, at play, were pinching and pricking each other's arms with needles. While the others cried out in pain, Baldwin endured it all with stoic calm. At first, the chronicler thought this a sign of incredible fortitude and strength of character, worthy of a future king. But upon closer inspection, he realized the terrible truth. The boy simply did not feel pain in his right arm. This was not heroism, it was a symptom. For a man of the 12th century, especially a scholar like William, the diagnosis was obvious and as dreadful as a death sentence: leprosy. In those times, the disease was considered not merely a physical ailment, but a curse from God, a sign of great sin. Lepers were outcasts, forced to wear bells to warn of their approach, living in separate colonies, effectively erased from society. And now this mark of damnation was placed upon the heir to the most sacred throne in Christendom, the throne of Jerusalem. The crown he was to inherit was now not just heavy, it was studded with invisible yet poisoned thorns. The discovery of his illness was the moment that divided Baldwin's life into before and after. It wasn't just a premonition, but an execution already underway, drawn out over years. Imagine the world of a vibrant child who suddenly learns that his own body has become his prison and his executioner. Every day, he would see in the mirror how the disease slowly but relentlessly consumed his flesh, distorting his features, numbing his limbs, turning him into a monster from nightmares. The entire aristocratic culture of the time was built on physical strength and valor. A king was expected to be the first knight, a role model, leading his troops into battle, firmly gripping a sword and shield. Baldwin was deprived of all this. He could never be a knight in the true sense. He could not hope for marriage and the continuation of his dynasty. His future was erased. This horror could have broken any grown man, let alone a child. But it was here, in the shadow of a slow death, that the incredible character that would later stun Saladin began to be forged. Instead of falling into despair or self-pity, Baldwin, as the chronicles attest, accepted his fate with astonishing courage. Realizing his body was doomed, he decided to make his mind and will, the parts of him the disease could not touch, his primary weapons. He plunged into his studies with renewed energy under William of Tyre, mastering history, law, military strategy, and diplomacy. He listened to the stories of old barons about battles and sieges, Absorbing their experience, he became a master horseman, learning to control his steed with his knees alone, while his hands could still function. His disease became his crucible. It burned away everything childish, everything frivolous, leaving only the pure, tempered steel of his will and the sharpness of his intellect. He learned early that his time was short, and therefore he could not afford the luxury of weakness or delay. This crucible of suffering created a ruler unlike any other in his era. In a world where power was associated with physical might and outward splendor, Baldwin was a living paradox. His weakness became the source of his unique strength. Firstly, his disease gave him a special, almost sacred status in the eyes of his subjects and enemies. He was not just a king, but a martyr king, marked by God. His suffering was perceived as a form of atonement for the sins of the entire kingdom. When he, overcoming his pain, led troops into battle, it had a colossal psychological impact on his knights. They saw before them not just their sovereign, but a living icon, a symbol of sacrifice and resilience. To fight alongside him was to be part of something greater than a mere battle for land or spoils. It was a battle for faith itself, and his personal example inspired them to acts of incredible heroism. Secondly, his ailment freed him completely from common human ambitions and vices. He had no need for personal glory, wealth, or carnal pleasures. He had only one goal, one all-consuming passion: to save his kingdom. This crystal clarity of purpose made his decisions remarkably precise and balanced. He was devoid of the egoism that so often ruined other rulers. He thought not of his dynasty, he could have none, but solely of the welfare of Jerusalem. This allowed him to rise above the petty squabbles and intrigues of his court, to see the larger picture, and to act with a cold, almost superhuman resolve. He knew that any day could be his last, and this gave him incredible courage. He did not fear death on the battlefield, because his life was already a slow death. He risked everything because he had nothing to lose but his kingdom, which he loved with the desperate passion of the doomed. When his father Amalric I died suddenly in 1174, Baldwin was only 13. According to the laws of the kingdom, he was still a minor, and a regent was appointed, initially the cautious and cunning Count Raymond III of Tripoli. The court immediately plunged into its familiar atmosphere of intrigue. Powerful baronial families, the Ibelins, the Courtenays, the Chatillons, began a struggle for influence over the young monarch. Many likely expected the sick boy to be merely a puppet in their hands, a pliant symbol of power, while they divided the real governance of the country. But they were gravely mistaken. Baldwin, despite his youth and progressing illness, quickly showed that he had no intention of being a pawn in their game. He listened carefully to advice, but he made the decisions himself. His voice, perhaps not yet broken, delivered commands with the firmness of an experienced monarch. He demonstrated an astonishing understanding of the political situation for his age. He knew the kingdom could not afford internal strife in the face of the threat from Saladin. One of his first significant acts was to assert his authority over the regent. He did not engage in open conflict, but subtly and consistently made it clear that he was the king. For instance, he refused to ratify a peace treaty Raymond had concluded with Saladin, deeming it humiliating. Instead, he led a daring raid on Damascus, showing the Sultan that Jerusalem was not about to surrender. It was a bold move that shocked both his enemies and his own vassals. He proved that beneath his fragile exterior lay an unbending will. This ailing teenager possessed an authority that neither his disease nor the ambitions of the most powerful feudal lords could shake. He ruled not by the strength of his muscles, but by the force of his intellect and character, and this force proved to be far more effective. Baldwin's inner demon, his secret and all-consuming motivation, was not a thirst for power or glory, but the desperate awareness that he was living on borrowed time. Every sunrise was both a gift and a reminder of the inexorable end. This constant race against time became the core of his short but brilliant life. Other kings could plan for decades ahead, forge dynastic marriages, raise heirs, and build long-term strategies. Baldwin did not have that luxury. His planning horizon was severely compressed. He had to accomplish everything: strengthen the borders, reconcile warring factions, find a worthy successor for his sister Sibylla, and most importantly, stop Saladin, in the few years fate had granted him. This existential urgency generated in him an incredible energy and resolve. He could not afford lengthy deliberations or hesitation. His decisions were swift, at times daring to the point of recklessness, but almost always brilliantly accurate. He acted as if every command were his last. This sense of inevitability gave him a special aura in the eyes of those around him. He was not merely a ruler, he was a tragic hero leading his people into battle, knowing he himself was doomed. This personal tragedy transformed his politics into a sacred mission. He was not just defending territory, he was trying to leave behind a legacy that would outlive his decaying body. He wanted to build an order in the kingdom that could stand even after his death. This is why he so desperately tried to control his sister's marriage, understanding that the future of Jerusalem would depend on her husband. His struggle was not only against Saladin, but also against the chaos that threatened to engulf his kingdom from within. And this internal battle, this race against his own death, was perhaps even more fierce and grueling than all his military campaigns. Managing a court teeming with ambitious and selfish barons was a task that would have demanded the utmost political cunning from any monarch. For a sick teenager, it seemed an impossible mission. The court of Jerusalem was a true nest of vipers. There were two main factions. The first, the court party, consisted of his close maternal relatives, Agnes de Courtenay and her brother Jocelyn, and newly arrived aristocrats from Europe, like the infamous Renaud de Chatillon and his sister's future husband, Guy de Lusignan. They were the hawks, proponents of an aggressive policy against Saladin, often motivated by personal greed and a thirst for glory. The second faction, the Barons' Party, was made up of old aristocratic families rooted in the Holy Land, such as the powerful Ibelins, and was led by Raymond of Tripoli. They were the Doves, pragmatists who understood the need to maintain a fragile balance of power and were open to diplomatic agreements with the Muslims. Baldwin, caught between these two millstones, sided with neither. Instead, he used their rivalry to strengthen his own power. He masterfully played on their conflicts, supporting first one faction, then the other, preventing either from gaining a decisive advantage. He operated on the principle of divide and rule, remaining the sole center of power, the one arbiter to whom everyone was forced to appeal. His physical weakness paradoxically aided him in this game. Since he could not personally participate in tournaments, feasts, and hunts, the main pastimes of the aristocracy, he was detached from their daily intrigues. He observed them as if from a distance, from the height of his throne and his suffering, which gave him a unique clarity of vision. His court was a place where conspiracies were woven, but his will was the axis that kept the kingdom from falling apart. Meanwhile, at the other end of this great chessboard, the figure of Salah ad-Din grew ever more powerful and menacing. His story is a classic example of the rise of a great leader. A Kurd by origin, he began his career in the service of the Syrian ruler Nur ad-Din. Sent to Egypt, he not only managed to seize control of that wealthy country, ending the Shiite Fatimid dynasty, but also, after Nur ad-Din's death in 1174, extended his power over Syria as well. For the first time in decades, the Crusader lands were caught between two powerful centers of force, both ruled by a single man. For Saladin, the expulsion of the Franks was not just a political objective, but a sacred duty, a jihad. He was a devout Muslim, as well as a brilliant organizer and commander. He reformed the army, strengthened the economy, and built madrasas and hospitals. He was not just a conqueror, but an empire builder. His reputation was impeccable. Even Christian chroniclers noted his generosity, nobility, and chivalrous conduct. He was the complete opposite of Baldwin, mature, healthy, at the peak of his physical and spiritual powers, the master of a vast and unified empire. In 1177, having consolidated his power in Syria, Saladin decided the time had come to strike a decisive blow against the Kingdom of Jerusalem. He knew it was ruled by a sick boy. He knew of the strife among the barons. He was certain the weakened state would fall like a ripe fruit. Assembling a massive army, he invaded the kingdom from the south, from Egypt, bypassing the main Crusader fortresses and heading straight for Jerusalem. He was so confident of his victory that he allowed his troops to disperse to plunder the surrounding countryside. This was his first and perhaps most fatal mistake in his confrontation with the dying king. It was precisely this mistake by Saladin that became the key to the miracle at Montgisard. Baldwin's victory was not merely an act of blind courage, but the result of a brilliant tactical calculation based on psychology and knowledge of the terrain. When news of the invasion reached Jerusalem, panic reigned at court. The kingdom's main forces were in the north, expecting an attack from Syria. At Baldwin's disposal was only a handful of warriors, about 375 knights, including 80 Templars under the command of Master Odo de Saint-Amand, a few thousand infantry, and militia. Anyone else in his position would have locked themselves within the walls of Ascalon or Jerusalem, hoping to withstand a siege. But Baldwin understood that this would only delay defeat. The only chance for salvation lay in a daring, unthinkable attack. He made a decision that seemed suicidal: to march out to meet Saladin's huge army and give battle in the open field. He exploited the Sultan's main miscalculation, his overconfidence. Saladin, believing he had scattered the main Frankish forces, was moving lightly toward Jerusalem, his troops spread out, and his heavy cavalry left behind. Baldwin, on the other hand, concentrated all his forces into a single armored fist. Moving along the coast, he managed to outflank Saladin's army and take up a favorable position on the hills near Montgisard, close to Ramla. Saladin was caught completely by surprise. He did not expect an attack, let alone one so ferocious. The sudden charge of the heavy knightly cavalry, amplified by the fanatical bravery of the Templars and inspired by the sight of their praying king, smashed his army's vanguard. Panic erupted in the Muslim ranks, quickly turning into a disorderly rout. Saladin's personal Mamluk guard was almost completely annihilated, and he himself barely escaped, fleeing ignominiously on a swift camel. The victory was absolute and devastating. Baldwin, unable to hold a sword, had commanded the battle with the force of his will and strategic genius. He had turned his weakness into an advantage. Saladin had simply underestimated him. He saw a sick boy and forgot that he was facing a king of warrior blood, possessing a mind that the most experienced commanders would envy. The success of Baldwin's reign, especially in the early years, depended heavily on the complex web of human relationships he wove around himself. His court was filled with vibrant and contradictory personalities, each of whom could be either a pillar of support or a mortal threat. His main antagonist was, without a doubt, Saladin, an enemy Baldwin respected. Their confrontation was not just a war between two states, but a duel of two personalities. The aging, wise, and powerful sultan versus the young, fading, but brilliant king. Among his allies and rivals, several key figures stood out. Raymond III of Tripoli, his former regent, was the most influential of the native barons. Intelligent, calculating, and ambitious, he was the main opponent of the court party and a proponent of peace with Saladin. Baldwin at times relied on his experience, at others feared his lust for power. The complete opposite of Raymond was Renaud de Chatillon, Lord of Ultra-Jourdain. An adventurer, pirate, and ruthless warrior, he was the embodiment of the wildest, most untamable Crusader spirit. His fortress, Kerak, controlled the caravan routes between Egypt and Syria, and he constantly violated truces with his predatory raids, provoking Saladin and undermining the fragile peace Baldwin tried to maintain. It was his recklessness that would ultimately become one of the main causes of the kingdom's downfall after the king's death. His sisters, Sibylla and Isabella, were also crucial figures. Sibylla, as the elder, was the key to the future of the throne. Her husband was destined to be the next king. Baldwin loved his sister, but her passionate and sometimes reckless nature caused him serious concern. And of course, there were the military orders, the Templars, and the Hospitallers. These warrior monks were the most professional and combat-ready part of the kingdom's army. Fanatically devoted to defending the Holy Land, they were indispensable in battle, but at the same time, they possessed enormous autonomy and did not always submit to royal authority, acting as they saw fit. Baldwin had to navigate between all these forces, using their strengths while restraining their destructive impulses. The most tragic and fateful decision of Baldwin's life concerned the marriage of his sister, Sibylla. Since he could not have children himself, Sibylla's husband would automatically become not only his brother-in-law, but also the likely heir to the throne and the future king of Jerusalem. This choice was more important than any battle won, as the long-term stability of the state depended on it. Initially, the choice fell on William of Montferrat, nicknamed Longsword, a member of a noble northern Italian family. He seemed an ideal candidate, but soon after the wedding and the birth of a son, the future King Baldwin V, he died of malaria. Sibylla was left a widow, and the question of her new husband became critically urgent once again. It was at this moment that Guy de Lusignan appeared on the historical stage, a handsome, but by all contemporary accounts, talentless and weak-willed aristocrat from Poitou. Sibylla fell passionately in love with him, and under pressure from his sister and the court party, which saw Guy as its puppet, Baldwin made a fatal mistake. In 1180, he consented to their marriage. He very quickly realized the full horror of his decision. Guy de Lusignan proved to be an incompetent military leader and a weak politician. Baldwin, whose health was rapidly deteriorating, was forced to watch as power gradually concentrated in the hands of a man he despised and distrusted. He tried to correct his mistake. He stripped Guy of the regency, publicly humiliated him, and even tried to force Sibylla to divorce him. But it was too late. The marriage was sealed, and Guy, supported by adventurers like Renaud de Chatillon, became the leader of the war party that was leading the kingdom to disaster. This choice, made perhaps out of love for his sister or in a moment of weakness, became the poisoned chalice that the king and all of Jerusalem would have to drink to the dregs. The full consequences of this decision would become apparent after Baldwin's death, leading to the rout at Hattin and the loss of the Holy City. Despite his progressing illness, the years following the victory at Montgisard became the zenith of Baldwin IV's fame and power. In the eyes of the entire Christian world, both in the East and in Europe, he became a living legend. Stories of the young leper king who defeated the great Saladin were passed from mouth to mouth, acquiring mythical details. He became a symbol of Christian courage, a new Gideon, a David who had defeated Goliath. This living martyr status gave him unshakable moral authority. Even the most defiant barons did not dare to openly contradict a monarch whose suffering was considered holy. Saladin, humiliated by the crushing defeat, was forced to temporarily abandon his plans to conquer Jerusalem and, in 1180, concluded a 2-year truce with Baldwin. This peace was the king's greatest achievement. He used this respite with maximum efficiency. Understanding that the main threat came from the north, from Damascus, Baldwin undertook a bold and strategically vital step. He began the construction of a powerful new fortress at Jacob's Ford on the Jordan River. This location was a key point on the route from Damascus to Galilee. The fortress, named Chastelet, was intended not only as a defensive outpost, but also as a staging ground for future attacks on Saladin's domains. It was a direct challenge to the Sultan, a demonstration that the Kingdom of Jerusalem was not just defending itself, but was ready for offensive action. During these years, Baldwin, despite the disease already beginning to seriously affect his sight and mobility, ruled with an iron fist. He personally inspected the construction, participated in war councils, and settled disputes between his vassals. He was the absolute master of his kingdom, and it seemed that his unbending will could stop not only Saladin, but the disease itself. But this appearance of stability was deceptive. The enemy that Baldwin could not defeat with either sword or diplomacy lived within him. Leprosy was inexorably doing its work. With each passing month, the crumbling facade of his body could less and less conceal the ruins within. By the early 1180s, he was almost blind. His hands and feet were covered in non-healing ulcers. He had lost sensation in his extremities, and he could barely move. The silver mask he was said to have worn to hide his disfigured face became not just a symbol, but a necessity. His physical decay became increasingly obvious to those around him, and this immediately affected the political situation in the kingdom. Ambitious barons, seeing the king was fading, began an ever more bitter struggle for power. Guy de Lusignan and Renaud de Châtillon, feeling emboldened, grew more audacious. Renaud, in particular, broke the truce with Saladin by launching a daring attack on a wealthy caravan, which was rumored to include the Sultan's own sister. This was an unheard-of insult that Saladin could not forgive. He swore to personally behead Renaud de Châtillon. War became inevitable. Baldwin was furious at his vassal's recklessness, but could no longer fully control the situation. His body was betraying him, and with it, it was betraying the entire kingdom. He was forced to appoint Guy de Lusignan as regent, as he himself could no longer sit on a horse and lead his troops. This decision, made under the pressure of circumstances, proved catastrophic. The kingdom, which had been held together solely by the willpower of one man, began to crumble as soon as that will was trapped in a dying, helpless body. The culmination of this tragic period was the Siege of Kerak in 1183. This episode perfectly illustrates the full depth of Baldwin's drama, his indomitable spirit, and his complete physical powerlessness. The castle of Kerak was the fief of Renaud de Châtillon, and it was there that the wedding of his stepson to the king's young sister, Isabella, was taking place. Saladin, enraged by Renaud's piratical acts and thirsting for revenge, used this occasion to besiege the castle with a huge army, while the kingdom's nobility celebrated inside. The situation was critical. The regent, Guy de Lusignan, assembled an army and marched to the rescue. But upon reaching Kerak, he displayed astounding indecisiveness and cowardice. He made camp within sight of the enemy, but never dared to attack, fearing the might of Saladin's army. In Jerusalem, news of Guy's inaction caused panic and rage. Baldwin, who by this time was almost completely blind and confined to his bed, realized his brother-in-law was leading the kingdom to its doom. And so, he did the unthinkable. Ordering himself to be carried on a litter, he personally set out for Kerak at the head of a small detachment. Picture the scene: a dying, blind king being carried onto the battlefield by his servants. The mere news of his approach had a magical effect. The soldiers, demoralized by Guy's inaction, regained their spirit. The barons, who despised Lusignan, rallied around the litter of their true monarch. Upon learning of the arrival of Baldwin, whom he both feared and respected, and wary of an attack by fresh forces, Saladin chose to lift the siege and retreat. Baldwin had saved the day, but the price was high. He had publicly humiliated his brother-in-law and regent, demonstrating his worthlessness to all. He had once again shown who the true ruler was, but it was his swan song, a final, desperate surge of will triumphing over the frailty of the flesh. After the humiliation at Kerak, Baldwin finally understood that Guy de Lusignan could never be a worthy ruler. From that moment on, he fought a war on two fronts. The external enemy remained Saladin, who, having recovered from his setbacks, continued to methodically tighten the ring around the kingdom. But an internal enemy, anarchy and the struggle for power at his own court, became just as dangerous. The king was obsessed with one idea: to prevent the crown from passing to the incompetent Guy after his death. He immediately removed him from the regency and sought a way to annul his marriage to Sibylla. He convened the High Council of Barons, demanding the dissolution of the union, but faced an unexpected obstacle. Sibylla, devoted to her husband, flatly refused to obey her brother's will. She declared that she would follow Guy even into exile. It was a heavy blow for Baldwin. He was trapped by his own dynastic law. He could not separate Sibylla from Guy, but to leave him as heir meant signing the kingdom's death warrant. The internal schism in the state reached its peak. The court party, led by the king's mother Agnes de Courtenay and patriarch Heraclius, supported Guy and Sibylla. The barons' party, led by Raymond of Tripoli and the Ibelins, was vehemently opposed and sought another candidate for the throne. Baldwin, his physical strength exhausted, spent the last remnants of his energy trying to contain these centrifugal forces, to prevent the state from collapsing while he was still alive. He was like Atlas holding up the sky, but his knees were already buckling, and he knew that soon he would fall, and the entire world would come crashing down with him. While the king's body slowly turned into its own tomb, his mind remained as sharp as a razor. The process of physical decay, which for anyone else would have been a source of madness or apathy, was for Baldwin merely the backdrop for unceasing intellectual and volitional work. The chronicles of the time, though sparse, convey the full horror of his condition. Leprosy, in its lepromatous form, which he likely suffered from, is a slow destruction of the peripheral nervous system, skin, limbs, and eyes. He ceased to feel touch, pain, heat, and cold. His fingers and toes, deprived of nerve endings, were constantly injured and infected, leading to necrosis and gradual tissue loss. His face, once handsome as contemporaries noted, transformed into a leonine mask, a classic symptom of the disease, with thickened brow ridges, a collapsed nose, and disfigured lips. By the end of his life, he was completely blind. And in this darkness, in this world without sensation, trapped in the cocoon of his own dying body, he continued to rule. His hearing remained acute, and he could flawlessly recognize every courtier by their voice, detecting the slightest note of falsehood or flattery. His memory was phenomenal. He remembered every treaty, every genealogical connection, every grievance and merit of each baron. His commands, which he dictated to scribes, were still precise and clear. The uncovered mask, his disfigured face which he could no longer hide, had a shocking and simultaneously hypnotic effect on visitors. They saw before them not a man, but some higher being who had already crossed the line between life and death, and his words acquired the weight of prophecy. In this desperate situation, knowing his days were numbered, Baldwin made his final political move, his chess gambit in an attempt to save the kingdom's future. If he could not get rid of Guy, he had to bypass him. The only way to do this was to crown another heir while he was still alive. That heir could only be one person, his nephew, Sibylla's son from her first marriage, a young boy who also bore the name Baldwin. In 1183, immediately after the incident at Kerak, the dying king summoned all the barons to Jerusalem. In the throne room of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, one of the most dramatic scenes in the kingdom's history unfolded. Baldwin, carried in on a litter, ordered his 5-year-old nephew to be brought forward. And there, with his own almost lifeless hand, he placed a small crown on the child's head. Baldwin V was proclaimed co-ruler and heir to the throne. The most experienced and pragmatic of the barons, Raymond of Tripoli, was to be regent for the young king. Guy de Lusignan was completely stripped of power. It was a brilliant and desperate move. Baldwin was creating a new political reality that was to take effect after his death. He tried to build a system of checks and balances. Raymond, as regent, would govern the state. The military orders would get control of the fortresses, and the crown revenues would support the young monarch. He was trying to tie the hands of Guy and Sibylla's faction, to strip them of legitimacy. It was his last desperate attempt to outplay fate, to build a dam that would hold back the flood of chaos after he was gone. But he was building it on sand, because the key element in this structure was a frail, sickly child. While Baldwin waged his heroic and hopeless struggle, his great adversary, Saladin, demonstrated one of his chief qualities: patience. After the humiliating defeat at Montgisard, he learned his lesson. He realized that the Crusaders, and especially their dying king, should not be underestimated. He no longer launched reckless assaults. Instead, he switched to a strategy of attrition. He knew that time was on his side. He knew about Baldwin's illness and the strife at the Jerusalem court. His spies reported every scandal, every conspiracy. And so he waited. His tactics became a strategy of 1,000 cuts. He launched raids on border territories, burned crops, and rustled cattle, exhausting the kingdom's economy. He forged alliances with neighboring Muslim rulers, tightening the circle of encirclement even further. He avoided major battles where the Franks' heavy knightly cavalry had the advantage. Instead, he preferred to besiege individual castles, forcing the Crusaders to constantly move their limited forces from one end of the country to the other. He played the long game, understanding that his greatest ally was the leprosy eating away at his enemy's body. There was a strange mixture of animosity and respect in his attitude toward Baldwin. Arab chroniclers, such as Baha ad-Din, write that Saladin admired the young king's courage. He saw in him a worthy opponent whose intellect and will were equal to his own. This personal duel between two great leaders was the axis of the entire region's politics. But Saladin was a pragmatist. He respected the king, but was merciless toward the kingdom. He was waiting for death to remove the one piece from the board that prevented him from declaring a final checkmate. In this desperate struggle for survival, the Kingdom of Jerusalem had one unique and formidable weapon: the military monastic orders, primarily the Templars, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, and the Hospitallers, the Order of St. John. These organizations were a unique product of the crusading era. combining monastic discipline with knightly valor. They were international corporations, possessing vast lands and wealth not only in the East, but also in Europe. Their knights were the best warriors of their time, professionals who had dedicated their entire lives to war against the infidels. They were fanatical, fearless, and bound by iron discipline. In any battle, a shock wedge of Templars or Hospitallers could decide the outcome, as it had at Montgisard. For Baldwin, they were both his greatest support and a constant headache. He could rely on their bravery in battle, but their political stance was often unpredictable. The orders answered directly to the Pope in Rome, not the King of Jerusalem, and jealously guarded their autonomy. Their grand masters, such as the charismatic but proud and unyielding Odo de Saint-Amand of the Templars, or the wiser Roger de Moulins of the Hospitallers, were influential political figures capable of challenging the king himself. They often held an extremely aggressive, hawkish position, scorning any truce with the Saracens. Their fanaticism, so useful on the battlefield, often turned into recklessness in politics, undermining the king's delicate diplomatic efforts. Baldwin was forced to constantly seek a balance, using their military might while reining in their political ambitions and preventing them from dragging the kingdom into a premature and disastrous war. One of the most vivid examples of the aggressive and provocative policy that Baldwin tried to use to his advantage was the construction of the fortress Chastelet at Jacob's Ford. This decision, made during the truce period after Montgisard, was a veritable slap in the face to Saladin. Jacob's Ford was a strategically important point that Saladin considered his own. By building a castle there, Baldwin not only violated unwritten rules, but also threw down a direct challenge to the Sultan's authority, demonstrating that the Kingdom of Jerusalem could project power far beyond its borders. The construction was carried out at a feverish pace. Baldwin personally invested huge sums in it. Saladin, upon learning of this, was furious. He offered Baldwin a vast sum of money, first 60, then 100,000 dinars, to stop the construction. But the king, urged on by the Templars to whom he intended to hand over the fortress, refused. He believed the castle would be the key to Galilee's security. This gamble was an enormous risk, and he knew it. He was playing with fire, deliberately provoking the enemy, hoping that strong walls and the valor of the Templars could withstand any blow. It was his attempt to seize the strategic initiative, to force Saladin to play his game. But this time, he had miscalculated. This fortress on the fault line between two worlds was doomed from the start. It became a symbol of Crusader pride, their belief that stone walls and steel swords could halt the tide of history, which was inexorably turning against them. Retribution for this audacity came swiftly. In 1179, as soon as the construction was mostly complete, Saladin assembled a massive force and laid siege to Chastelet. Baldwin, who was in Tiberias at the time, immediately marched to its aid, but he was too late. The siege was short and brutal. Saladin's engineers dug a mine under one of the towers, filled it with combustible materials, and set it ablaze. The tower collapsed, and through the breach in the wall, the Sultan's warriors poured in. The defenders, mostly Templars, fought with desperate courage, but the forces were too unequal. Almost the entire garrison was slaughtered. 700 knights and soldiers were killed, another 800 taken captive. Saladin ordered the fortress to be razed to the ground. The fall of Chastelet was a heavy blow to the Kingdom of Jerusalem, both militarily and psychologically. It nullified the euphoria of the victory at Montgisard. The Crusaders once again felt their vulnerability. Fear returned to the cities and castles of Outremer. For Baldwin, it was also a personal defeat. He had lost a vital strategic point, a huge amount of money, and, most devastatingly, hundreds of his best warriors, who were irreplaceable. This failure showed that a miracle like Montgisard might not happen again. It demonstrated that courage and tactical genius alone were not enough to withstand the overwhelming power and resources of Saladin's empire. It was a harsh lesson that forced Baldwin to act more cautiously thereafter, but he could no longer stop madmen like Renaud de Chatillon. If the construction of Chastelet was a risky but strategically calculated provocation, the actions of Renaud de Chatillon were pure madness, justifiable only by greed and adventurism. In 1182, during another truce, he did the unthinkable. Building a small fleet on the Red Sea, he sent it to plunder Muslim merchant ships and coastal cities. But his ultimate goal was even more sacrilegious. He intended to reach Medina and Mecca, the holy cities of Islam, to destroy the Kaaba and desecrate the tomb of the Prophet Muhammad. For the Muslim world, this was tantamount to a declaration of total war of annihilation. The threat to Islam's holiest sites sent a wave of outrage from Morocco to Persia. Saladin was enraged. He immediately dispatched his fleet, which destroyed the Crusader pirates' ships. The prisoners were taken to Cairo and executed with particular cruelty. Some, as a lesson to all infidels, were taken to Mecca and slaughtered like sacrificial animals during the Hajj. Renaud's adventure brought the kingdom nothing but shame and the hatred of the entire Islamic world. It permanently destroyed any possibility of a long-term peace with Saladin. The Sultan now saw the Crusaders not just as enemies, but as barbarians and blasphemers who had to be destroyed. His personal oath to behead Renaud became the leitmotif of his future policy. Baldwin was powerless to do anything. He could not punish his powerful and insubordinate vassal without provoking a civil war. The madness of the pirate lord had placed a black mark upon the kingdom, and now only one question remained. When exactly would Saladin come to carry out his sentence? By 1185, it was clear that the end was near. Baldwin IV, only 24 years old, was dying. He was completely blind, bedridden, and suffering from constant fevers. Realizing his agony would not last long, he gave his final orders. His last political will was to confirm the status of his nephew, Baldwin V, as the sole king. He once again affirmed Raymond of Tripoli as regent, taking an oath of loyalty to the boy from him and the other barons. He hoped that Raymond's authority and the collective oath could restrain the ambitions of Guy and Sibylla for at least a few years, until the new king was older. It was the dying genius's last attempt to bring order to the world he was leaving. He tried to use his authority, his shadow, to protect the fragile equilibrium he had so painstakingly built throughout his reign. He knew that disaster would strike with the child king's death, but he hoped to give his kingdom at least a few more years of peace. That child's crown, placed on the head of a sickly boy, was a symbol not of strength, but of a desperate, almost hopeless hope. A hope that his sacrifice had not been in vain, that his short, suffering-filled life had meaning. He was passing the baton, knowing that the runner who took it was weak and might fall at any moment. But he had no other choice. The resolution to the central question, how a young leper king defeated Saladin's army, turns out to be bitter and ironic. Yes, he performed a miracle at Montgisard. He won one of the most brilliant victories in the history of the Crusades. He did it through a combination of factors: his personal, brilliant audacity that bordered on suicide, the fanatical bravery of his warriors, inspired by his example, and the tactical miscalculation and overconfidence of Saladin himself. He proved that the strength of the spirit could overcome the strength of arms. But in the long run, this victory proved to be a Pyrrhic one. It gave the kingdom a few years of respite, but did not change the strategic balance of power. the Crusader kingdom remained a small island in a vast, hostile ocean. The victory at Montgisard created a dangerous illusion among some of the barons, especially the war party, that Saladin could always be beaten, that an aggressive policy would bring success. This recklessness, so vividly demonstrated by the actions of Renaud de Chatillon, ultimately destroyed the kingdom. Baldwin's will had held this impulse in check, but after his death, the dam broke. Thus, his greatest triumph indirectly contributed to the subsequent catastrophe. He showed that it was possible to win, but he failed to teach his successors the wisdom needed to preserve peace. The miracle occurred, but it did not save. It only delayed the inevitable, making the subsequent fall even more devastating and tragic. On March 16, 1185, Baldwin IV, King of Jerusalem, protector of the Holy Sepulchre, died. His death, unlike his life, was quiet and peaceful. He passed away in his palace in Jerusalem, surrounded not by the clamor of battle, but by the sorrowful silence of his court. He was only 24 years old. He was buried with full honors in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, alongside his ancestors, the Crusader kings. His passing marked the end of an era. It was not just a strong personality that was gone, but the very axis that held the entire fragile structure of the Kingdom of Jerusalem together. While he lived, his authority, his will, and his intellect were the force that prevented internal contradictions from tearing the country apart. With his death, a ringing silence fell over Jerusalem, but it was the silence before the storm. Everyone waited with bated breath. What would happen next? The fragile structure he had left behind, the child king Baldwin V, under the regency of Raymond of Tripoli, did not last long. A year later, in 1186, the boy king died, and then the chaos that Baldwin IV had so feared was unleashed. His sister Sibylla and her husband, Guy de Lusignan, deceiving the barons, seized the throne. Power fell into the hands of the very people the dying king had considered the gravediggers of the kingdom. His worst fears had come true. The legacy of Baldwin IV is dual and tragic. To the Western world, he has forever remained a hero, a knight without fear or blame, a holy warrior whose faith and courage crushed the enemy. His image inspired poets and writers. He became a symbol of the indomitable spirit triumphing over bodily frailty. Even in the Muslim world, he was remembered with respect as a worthy and noble adversary. But his actual historical legacy is the catastrophe that erupted immediately after his death. He was the Dutch boy with his finger in the dike. While he lived, the dike held. As soon as he was gone, the flood of history burst through, sweeping everything away in its path. The new rulers, Guy de Lusignan and Renaud de Chatillon, immediately provoked a war with Saladin. In 1187, just 2 years after Baldwin's death, the decisive Battle of Hattin took place. The Christian army, tormented by thirst and Guy's inept command, was surrounded and utterly destroyed. Saladin, as he had sworn, personally beheaded Renaud de Chatillon. Guy de Lusignan was taken captive. The holiest relic of Christendom, the true cross, was seized. The road to Jerusalem lay open. On October 2, 1187, Saladin entered the Holy City without a fight, after it had been in Christian hands for 88 years. The ghost of Baldwin, his warnings, his desperate political gambits, all of it hung over the battlefield at the Horns of Hattin. His life was a heroic, but ultimately futile attempt to stop an avalanche. He won several great battles, but he lost the war against fate. So, we return to the central paradox. How did a leper boy defeat the great Sultan? The answer is now clear and multi-layered. He won not in spite of his disease, but in many ways because of it. Leprosy. by taking from him everything valued in the knightly world: physical strength, beauty, health, a future, gave him something far more valuable in return. It gave him absolute clarity of purpose. He lived solely to save his kingdom. It gave him the unique moral authority of a martyr king, which inspired his warriors to miracles of bravery. It sharpened his intellect, forcing him to rely on his mind rather than his sword. It gave him the fearlessness of the doomed, allowing him to make risky and unpredictable decisions that baffled his enemies. His physical weakness became his main tactical weapon. At Montgisard, Saladin simply didn't take him seriously and paid the price. Thus, his strength was born directly from his decay. He was the embodiment of the idea that the spirit can truly triumph over the flesh. But this paradox has a tragic reverse side. The same disease that made him great also limited his time and prevented him from finishing his work, preparing a worthy successor, and ensuring stability after his departure. He was a brilliant flash, a comet that streaked across the sky of the Holy Land. But after him came only a deeper darkness. His triumph and his tragedy were inextricably linked, woven into the tight knot of his short and incredible life. Ultimately, the story of Baldwin IV transcends a medieval chronicle of battles and kings. It is a universal myth about the human spirit, about its ability to resist seemingly insurmountable circumstances. This young man's life is a concentrated expression of one of the central themes of human history: the struggle of a solitary will against the inexorable flow of time and fate. Did he turn the river of history back? No. His kingdom fell. His cause was lost. But in the very act of this struggle, in his desperate and brilliant resistance, in his refusal to surrender to his body, his enemies, his doom, therein lies his true greatness and his immortality. Baldwin IV teaches us that the meaning of a life is measured not by its length or its ultimate success, but by the intensity of its burning, by the strength of will shown in the face of oblivion. He lost his war, but he won the battle for human dignity. And as long as people tell stories of courage, of the power of the spirit, and of the tragic heroes who dared to challenge fate, the name of the young leper king who crushed the army of Saladin will not be forgotten. His story is an eternal reminder that even in the weakest, most disease-ravaged body, there can dwell a will capable of shaking empires, and for a moment, stopping death itself.